Do you feel like you're fighting alone against a spiritual emptiness that seems endless? Have you ever wondered why, even with so much effort, your faith remains weak, your soul restless, and your life distant from the presence of God? Maybe you're stuck in a desert, surrounded by sand on all sides, and you can't see the way back to the sacred. But what if I told you there is a clear and powerful path that can lead you from pain to salvation? And it begins now. This video is not just a story, it's a mirror of your own journey, a walk between heaven and the sands, where deep revelations will awaken your spirituality, rekindle your faith, and reconnect you with the true essence of worship. And listen carefully. If you leave before the end, you might miss the key you've been searching for all these years in your life with God. Oh, and one quick but important note. Most people who watch our videos are not yet subscribed to the channel. If you want to receive content that strengthens your faith, nourishes you with true doctrine, and brings transforming revelations, subscribe now and activate the bell. God has something special to deliver to you, and you can't afford to miss it. Watch until the end. Your salvation may depend on it. Since childhood, John carried in his heart a sensitivity that no one could explain. While other children played carefree in the yard, he spent hours gazing at the sky, wondering what existed beyond the clouds. It was on a rainy night, after the sudden death of his grandmother, a woman of prayer, firm in faith and full of spirituality, that he had his first awakening. Sitting on the porch, listening to the sound of water falling from the roof, he prayed with simple yet profound words. It was as if something inside him had been lit. The pain of loss brought a new awareness. He needed to understand the meaning of life, and that would only be possible if he dove into the sacred. Religion became the foundation of John's formation. His parents, humble and God-fearing, made a point of taking their children to church every Sunday. The doctrine taught in church shaped his way of thinking and acting. From an early age, he learned that faith was not just a belief floating in the air, but a way of life expressed through actions, respect for others, and faithfulness to the divine word. He grew up hearing stories of miracles, revelations, and salvation, and these narratives fueled his desire to draw closer and closer to the divine. But over the years, John came to understand that true faith was not a destination, but a journey. It wasn't enough to memorize verses or attend services automatically. One had to live faith with sincerity, and this, he discovered, required facing oneself. During a turbulent phase in his youth, when he began drifting from church and questioning the truths he once knew, he realized that his faith was still immature. It was in the silence of his room, after many nights of anguish, that he found the divine presence again, not with thunder, but with gentleness. That's when he began to walk the true path of salvation. Prayer became his refuge. John began to seek, with fervor, not only answers, but revelation. He felt that the divine was not a distant concept, but someone real, someone who listened to him and understood him, even when he didn't know what to say. Many times he prayed through tears, and at other times he simply sat in silence, feeling the peace that only the Spirit can bring. He came to understand that prayer is the bridge between heaven and earth. It is through it that man finds direction, strength, and comfort. And the more he prayed, the deeper his spirituality grew. What was once separate, faith and life, now became one. John began to see the sacred in the small actions of daily life, in the way he treated his parents, in the honesty with which he worked, in the care he took with his words. His spirituality no longer depended on extraordinary moments, but was infused in everything he did. He learned that worship is not limited to songs sung in a service, but is expressed in every act of love and obedience. Everyday life became a temple, and his heart a living altar. Even so, John deeply valued collective worship. He knew that there, among brothers and sisters, faith was strengthened. He understood that worship was a moment of communion, learning, and mutual encouragement. There, he not only received, but also shared his experiences of faith. He became known as someone who always had the right word at the right time, the result of a life of prayer and intimacy with the divine. Worship was not just an event. It was a continuous celebration of the grace and presence of the God who transformed him day by day. But John also understood that salvation was not a trophy to be earned once and for all. It was a daily process of surrender, purification, and faithfulness. He faced temptations, failures, uncertainties. There were days when he wanted to give up, but in those moments, he remembered the words of Scripture, "The righteous shall live by faith." And that was enough to keep going. He realized that being saved meant, above all, remaining firm, even when everything seemed to go against him. It meant trusting in grace, in mercy, and in the immense love of the divine. And of course, there was no shortage of obstacles. There were seasons when God seemed to be silent. The emptiness gnawed at him from the inside, and he wondered whether he was on the right path. But it was in that desert that he grew the most. He learned that God's silence also speaks, that not every prayer needs an immediate answer, and that true faith endures even when heaven seems closed. John came to understand that mature spirituality bears the weight of waiting, because it knows that at the right time the revelation will come. And when it comes, it changes everything. His life became a living testimony. People saw something different in him, not because of eloquent words, but because of the way he lived. John didn't seek recognition, but his example spoke louder than any sermon. Many began to reconnect with their faith after witnessing his serenity, his consistency, his quiet worship. He discovered in practice that shared faith has the power to spark life in other hearts. Today, when looking back at his story, John recognizes that everything, every tear, every prayer, every worship service, every fall, and every new beginning was part of a greater purpose. The journey of faith was not easy, but it was sacred. He knows it's not over yet, but he moves forward with his eyes fixed on the divine, certain that salvation is not a finish line, but a living road, walked day by day, step by step with confidence, devotion, and love. John was not unlike many other young people. He grew up in a simple home where faith was lived more by tradition than by revelation. His mother always said, "Son, never go to bed without praying," and he obeyed, but his mind was far away, distracted. Spirituality to him was like a breeze, felt but not understood. Everything changed one night that seemed ordinary. John's grandmother, a woman of deep devotion, had fallen seriously ill. She was the spiritual pillar of the household, the one who prayed aloud, fasted in silence, and carried in her eyes the certainty of salvation. When she passed into eternity, something broke in John's heart. But at the same time, something was also ignited. In the pain of that loss, John found himself alone with his questions for the first time. Is there really life beyond this one? What if my faith is just empty repetition? That's when the Spirit began to blow in a different way. Pain, though bitter, is often God's golden tool. Just as Moses had to flee to the desert to hear the voice of the Most High, Exodus 3, John too was led into his own inner desert. Sitting in a dark room, crying silently, he prayed the most sincere prayer of his life. "Lord, if you are really there, speak to me in some way." It wasn't an audible voice nor a shining light, but a sudden peace, soft as the morning breeze, filled his chest. My dear friend, how many times have you been in that same place, between despair and faith, between emptiness and the longing for something more? It is in those moments that the sacred is revealed. John didn't know it, but in that instant, heaven was closer than he imagined. Christ himself promised that whoever knocks, the door will be opened, Matthew 7:7. And John had knocked, with tears and with his heart laid bare. And here's something few people say. Spiritual awakening is not an outward spectacle. It's an inner revolution. John's life didn't change instantly. He had no visions or gifts, but his eyes began to see differently. The Bible, which once seemed like an old, difficult book, now spoke to him. Verses leapt off the page, and he felt as though God was speaking directly to his heart. Like in Jeremiah 29:13, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." John's faith began to move from inherited belief to personal conviction. He no longer believed just because he was taught. Now he believed because he experienced it. And that, my brother, my sister, is what turns religion into relationship, doctrine into direction, belief into living certainty. Many ask, but how do I know I'm spiritually awakening? The answer is simple and profound. When what once seemed ordinary begins to fill with meaning, when you start to hunger for the word, when prayer is no longer a duty but a necessity, that's a sign that God is calling you closer. John began waking up earlier just to talk with the Lord. He didn't know how to pray long prayers, but he spoke from the heart, and that's what matters most. It's not the length of the words, but the weight of the sincerity. Jesus himself taught us not to use vain repetitions, Matthew 6:7, but rather to go into our room, close the door, and pray to the Father in secret. Authentic spirituality doesn't shout, it whispers, transforms in silence, and renews through consistency. From that point on, Jerome began to follow a path that many did not understand. His friends discovered that he had changed too much, but he knew when the Spirit awakens someone, priorities change. He exchanged parties for religious services, empty conversations for moments alone with God. Faith began to guide his steps, and no longer the opinions of others. He still made mistakes, stumbled, yes, like any human being, but something inside him no longer allowed him to remain in error. There was a voice, a presence, a light. Spiritual awakening, my brother, my sister, is not the end. It is only the beginning. And it is from here that we will understand how religion, when lived with purpose, can be the firm foundation of an entire life. Since he was little, Jerome was surrounded by sacred rituals and symbols. His mother, a woman, firm in doctrine, made a point of taking him to church every Sunday. Even when it rained, even when he wanted to stay home watching TV, she would say, "The house of God is a priority, son." And this repetition, this zeal for sacred things, was planting seeds. At first glance, it may seem like just fantasy, but over time it will sink into the heart. It's like Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." John doesn't understand everything, of course, but he saw the sparkle in the shepherd's eyes. He heard the fervent prayers of his older sisters, and something there began to take root in his soul. Religion, more than a set of rules, began to become a structure, a kind of map for understanding the world and life. But you see, my brother, my sister, it's not just about memorizing verses or attending church services. True religion, the kind that transforms, is lived in everyday life. John learned from his mother that inspiration is not just what you do in the temple, but how you treat others, how you react to trials, how you live with integrity even when no one is looking. And this religious formation took place in the little things: prayer before meals, praise while washing the dishes, reading the Psalms before bed. All of this shaped Joan's spirituality. He saw faith not as an obligation, but as part of life. And this, my dears, is what many lose sight of today, that religion is not a burden. It is a path that leads to salvation when lived with love and reverence. As Joan grew older, I began to ask deeper questions. Why do we have to forgive those who hurt us? Why does God allow pain? And it was in the Bible that his mother taught him to seek answers. She would say, "Son, the word is alive. It speaks to us if we open our hearts." And indeed, the more he read, the more he felt connected to the divine. Joan discovered a religion that is very alive and not isolated. It brings people together, it heals, it reveals purpose. As James 1:27 teaches, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. In other words, it is not just about liturgy, but about practice, compassion, and holiness in everyday life. It is true that not everything was rosy. There were times when John felt confident, as if he could not make mistakes because of the faith he professed. But over time, he learned that God does not seek perfection, but rather sincerity. The doctrine that had previously seemed strange was revealed as protection. Religion began to be seen not as a fence that limits, but as a wall that protects. And that made all the difference. John understood that everything his family practiced, fasting, prayer, and family worship, were not empty rituals, but living expressions of a deep belief that pointed to something much greater, the real presence of God in their lives. And so, little by little, John's faith grew stronger. He began to understand that true religion is not an end in itself, but an instrument to lead us to Christ. It is through religion that we learn to pray deeply, to worship with understanding, and to live with fear and hope. John's spiritual life began to flourish in this fertile ground, and even in moments of weakness, he knew where to seek refuge. He knew that the altar was not just a physical place, but a position of the heart before divinity. Now, prepared by this firm foundation, John was ready to face the challenges ahead, and that is precisely what we will talk about in the next topic, the crisis of faith and inner conflict, a stage in the journey of those who seek true salvation. There comes a time in every Christian's journey when faith is put to the test. For John, this time came when everything seemed to be going well. He had established himself in the church, helped with services, read the word every day, and even advised his friends about spirituality. But suddenly, like a shadow covering the sky on a clear day, a feeling of emptiness set in. Reasonable prayers did not reach the ceiling. Praises no longer touched the heart, as before. He began to wonder if all of this was real or just a result of repetition. It's hard to admit, but even the most devout face this dark night of the soul. And John was there, in the dark, searching for light. As the psalmist cried out in Psalm 13:1, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" John also felt God's silence, and it shook him deeply. This crisis was not the result of deliberate sin, but of an internal weariness, a conflict between what he believed and what he felt. And this, my brother, my sister, is more common than it seems. Many think that having faith means never doubting, but that's not true. Having faith is continuing even when you have doubts. It's following through even when you don't feel it. John didn't know this yet, but he was learning what it means to walk by faith and not by sight. So 2 Corinthians 5:7. There were days when he felt like an imposter, someone who talked about God, but inside struggled to believe. He tried to hide behind rituals, but his heart was at war. And there is no worship or adoration that can replace the naked truth of a soul in conflict. The revelation that John needed was no longer in words, it was in experience. During this phase, he even thought about moving away. He wanted to take a break from church, from prayer, from religious life, but something was stopping him. An inner voice, even if weak, said, "Stay a little longer, just one more day." And he stayed, dragged, tired, but he stayed. It was then that he understood that faith is not a straight line, but a path full of curves, ups and downs. The crisis did not come to destroy him, but to deepen his roots. Just as gold is tested in fire, 1 Peter 1:7, John was being purified. God had not been silent, he was in fact teaching him to listen, in a different way. Because when heaven is silent, it is a sign that the time has come to mature. Divinity does not absent itself. It teaches in silence too. During this period, John found solace in the Psalms. David, with his restless soul, became a faithful companion. He read and saw himself in the words, "Why are you cast down, O my soul?" Psalm 42:5. And it was in this dialogue between pain and hope that John rediscovered prayer. Not formal prayer, but prayer as an outlet. He began to write letters to God, opening his heart in honest words. He cried as he wrote, and something began to change. Little by little, his faith was restored, not by force, but by grace. Spirituality was no longer fragile, like a newborn plant. It was like a deep, resistant root, invisible to the eye, but firm beneath the soil of the soul. The crisis of faith, paradoxically, led John to a more mature belief. Religion was no longer just a structure, it was pulsating life. He understood that God is not offended by our questions, but finds us in them. The inner conflict revealed areas that still needed healing, strengthened his intimacy with the Father, and planted in him a compassion he had never felt before. John began to look at others with more mercy, with less judgment. He learned that the deepest worship often comes from the most hidden pain. And with this new, more humble, more sincere vision, he began to live his faith with more authenticity. And now, with this strengthened foundation, he was ready for what was to come next, the personal encounter with God, which changed his life once and for all. After going through the valley of doubt and spiritual loneliness, John found himself more sensitive, more attentive. His heart no longer carried that subtle arrogance of someone who thinks he knows everything about faith, spirituality, and doctrine. On the contrary, there was now a humble emptiness, a space that, without him knowing it, was being prepared for something great. And it was precisely when John stopped trying to control his spiritual life that God decided to reveal himself in a personal and intense way. On an ordinary night, with no miracle in sight, John retreated to prayer. But this time, he didn't ask for anything. He simply said, "Lord, if you are still with me, speak to me." And it was there, in the silence of the room, that the sacred touched his soul with a gentleness that words cannot describe. There were no flashes of lightning or spectacular visions. But something inside him broke, or perhaps it was completed. John felt a presence that invaded the room like a gentle wind, as in 1 Kings 19:12, when Elijah perceived God not in the fire or the earthquake, but in the gentle breeze. It was as if the arms of the Father himself were wrapping him, saying, "Son, I have never left here." He wept like a child, not in sadness, but in liberation. For the first time, he understood what true worship is, the kind that springs not from sound, but from the Spirit. The revelation was clear. God did not want John to know him only through tradition or religion, but through experience. His faith, which had previously been nourished by the strength of others, was now beginning to blossom from the inside out. This meeting was not an end point, but a turning point. From then on, John began to see praying everything differently. The scriptures, which had previously seemed repetitive, now jumped out at him with new colors. Prayer, which had previously seemed mechanical, became a living dialogue, and worship, oh worship, became a time of celebration, not obligation. John understood what Jesus said in John 4:23, "But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth." And there he was, being shaped by that truth. The religion that had created him was now being reconfigured into a living, personal, ardent spirituality, no longer out of fear of making mistakes, but out of love for a divinity that knew him by name. And how did this apply to his daily life? John began to live differently, not with spiritual superiority, but with lightness and compassion. He listened more, judged less. He began to see people not as projects to be corrected, but as souls loved by God. Salvation for him stopped being a distant concept and became a daily process, a constant surrender, a humble walk. He no longer worried so much about appearing strong. On the contrary, he learned that grace is made perfect in weakness, 2 Corinthians 12:9. And this humility made his faith deeper, more rooted. Spirituality became practical, forgiving those who hurt him, helping in silence, praying for those who rejected him, loving without return. And so, the John who had previously known God by hearsay came to know him by walking with him. And it is incredible how this changes everything. Not that his problems were over, far from it. But now he knew where his refuge was. He knew that prayer was a bridge, not a monologue. That doctrine was not a prison, but a compass. That religion, when lived with love, is a ladder that leads to heaven. And this new John was just beginning to walk the path of true worship, and it was precisely in this renewed spirit that he would face what was to come. The trials and tribulations of the Christian life, because genuine faith, sooner or later, is put to the test in the realm of reality. John's inner transformation was profound, but it did not mean the end of his struggles. Quite the opposite. After his encounter with God, difficult days came. It is even curious how, right after spiritual renewal, many face headwinds. John began to face situations that tested his faith intensely. He lost his job without explanation, faced an unexpected health problem, and, to top it all off, people close to him began to distance themselves. It was as if everything was falling apart around him, and at that stage, he learned in practice what James wrote so clearly. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various temptations, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. James 1:2-3. It was not easy, but John was no longer the same. The spirituality that had previously trembled with any wind now remained firm, even with a heavy heart. During these days of struggle, prayer became his most constant refuge. He would wake up, and before even getting out of bed, he would speak to God. Lord, I don't understand what's happening, but I trust in you. And this simple phrase became a type of worship, a daily surrender. Sometimes he would cry in silence. Other times he couldn't even pray. He would just stand in silence before the sacred. But he knew that there, in that silence, God was listening. As it is written in Romans 8:26, the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. John began to understand that the purest worship is not always made of words or songs, but of surrender. And in the deepest pain, this surrender becomes a daily worship. One of the most memorable moments of this phase was when John, even though he was in need, chose to help a family from the church who was also suffering. He shared the little he had, not out of religious obligation, but out of compassion. And it was then that he discovered a key to the kingdom. Even in difficult times, there is power in serving. This attitude brought him an unexpected peace, a supernatural comfort. It was as if, by comforting others, God himself was comforting him. This reminded John of 2 Corinthians 1:4. It is he who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we can comfort those who are in any trouble. The faith that had previously been theoretical now became practical. Religion was no longer just doctrine, but action. Of course, there were times when he wanted to give up. The flesh is weak, and suffering tires. But in those moments, John remembered all that God had already done. He began to write down in a notebook the small daily miracles, a word of encouragement, an unexpected help, an answered prayer. This strengthened his soul. He realized that salvation is not a prize that is earned, but a path that is followed with perseverance. The Christian life, full of ups and downs, requires courage and faith. And it is on this journey that God will shape us, as a potter shapes clay, Jeremiah 18:6. John was being molded, sometimes with pain, but always with purpose. And so, even in the midst of tribulations, John grew. His faith was no longer fragile as before. Now it was like a rock that resisted time and storms. He learned that mature spirituality is that which worships even without answers, that prays even without strength, that trusts even without seeing. And in this fire of afflictions, God was forging in him a solid, unshakable faith. John began to see difficulties not as punishments, but as instruments of revelation, moments when divinity reveals itself in unexpected ways. And with this understanding, he moved forward, because the journey of faith does not end in the desert. And John's next step would lead him to experience something even deeper, the call to serve and teach others, a new level in his spiritual journey. After walking through the valley, being shaped by pain and finding steadfastness in his faith, John began to feel a new weight on his heart, a weight that, unlike affliction, did not oppress him, but rather propelled him. It was as if something inside him said, "Now that you have learned to trust, it is time to teach." And indeed, this is one of the most beautiful fruits of spirituality. When faith matures, it overflows. John did not seek recognition or position in the church, but there was a sacred ardor within him, a holy restlessness that led him to care deeply for the people around him. As Paul said to Timothy, "And the things that you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will be able to teach others." Also, 2 Timothy 2:2. John was no longer just a follower. He was becoming a trainer of other disciples. It all started simply. A young man new to the church asked for help in understanding the scriptures. John was willing to walk with him. Later, another person approached him with questions about prayer. Later, a woman invited him to share a word at a home meeting. Little by little, God began to use him, not because of his titles, but because of his testimony. João understood that serving is more than being part of a schedule. It is being available, sensitive to the voice of the Spirit. He learned to listen to people, to perceive their pain, to pray for them without rushing. And with that, religion, which had previously been just a rule, became a mission. His heart was inflamed with the desire to see others know the salvation that he had known, not just by hearing about it, but by experiencing it. One of the most powerful lessons was realizing that teaching is not about pouring out knowledge, but about opening paths. João learned that many times a story told with humility transforms more than an eloquent sermon. He told of his struggles, his falls, his victories, always with reverence, always pointing to divinity as the source of redemption. His spirituality was real, without makeup. This generated confidence. People saw him as an older brother, someone who did not place himself above, but rather alongside. John lived out what is written in 1 Peter 5:2-3. Feed the flock of God that is among you, not as lording it over those entrusted to you, but as examples to the flock. In his daily life, he became a point of reference, but without ever losing his simplicity. He continued to sweep the church floor, help with visitors, and prepare coffee for meetings. John knew that greatness in the kingdom of God is measured by service, not by the stage. He began to disciple new converts, organized prayer times in their homes, and promoted meetings to read and study the Word. In all of this, his life was a constant worship. His faith left trails of hope wherever he went. And perhaps most importantly, John understood that teaching is an act of worship. Each soul edified, each life restored, each doubt clarified was a way of glorifying God. This calling also brought challenges. Not everyone accepted his advice. Some criticized him, others envied him. But John had learned not to be moved by applause, nor to be discouraged by rejection. His focus was on pleasing the one who called him. He knew that in the end, the true teacher is the Holy Spirit, and he was just a vessel, and that was enough for him. Serving and teaching became living expressions of his faith, constant practices of his spirituality, and natural reflections of the salvation that now pulsed in his soul. But there was still more, because after all this, John would discover that the journey of faith is not a finish line. It is a path of constancy, and the next step would reveal the value of perseverance in following through to the end. John had already gone through many remarkable moments: the discovery of faith, the reunion with God, the deserts of the soul, the calls to service. But now, he faced a new kind of challenge, that of spiritual routine. It was no longer about facing great storms or experiencing extraordinary revelations. It was about keeping going, even when nothing special was happening. It was about getting up every day, praying even when you didn't feel like it, worshiping even when you didn't feel like it, obeying even without answers. And that was when John discovered the beauty of perseverance, the kind of faith that is not fed by sensations, but by conviction. He constantly remembered what is written in Hebrews 10:36. For you have need of patience, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. This period required more than enthusiasm. It required discipline. John began to develop a solid, devotional life, with time set aside for reading the Word, meditation, and prayer. He created habits that sustained him even on the coldest days of his soul. He understood that spirituality does not depend on the environment or emotional climate, but on commitment to the sacred. A biblical example that inspired him was Daniel. Even in a foreign land, even in hostile times, Daniel prayed 3 times a day faithfully. Daniel 6:10. John wanted this constancy, this kind of devotion that remains firm even when no one is looking. And over time, what seemed simple or repetitive began to produce deep fruits in his soul. Perseverance also taught him about the importance of community. There were days when John did not have the strength to pray, and in those moments his brothers in faith became a vital support. He understood that walking with Christ is also walking with the body of Christ. He learned to ask for help, to confess weaknesses, to accept advice. Corporate worship became more than an event. It was a renewal. Community worship, moments of group intercession, Bible studies, all of this fed his faith consistently. As it is written in Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. But not everything was predictable. In the midst of this constancy, unexpected trials arose. John faced unfair criticism, saw loved ones stray from the faith, and went through moments of profound spiritual silence. However, he had already learned not to measure God's presence by feelings, but by the faithfulness of his word. And that was what kept him steadfast. He knew that salvation is a process, a daily journey. That faith, when maintained with constancy, grows deep roots and produces lasting fruits. John began to understand that God values perseverance because it reveals true love. After all, those who truly love do not give up. And so, John continued, steadfast, not because he was strong, but because he knew in whom he believed. He had discovered the secret of the Christian walk. It is not about winning all the battles, but about not stopping fighting. His spirituality was now solid. His doctrine lived, his worship mature. Prayer, faith, worship, revelation, and service were intertwined in a life that glorified divinity in every detail. And on this journey, he continued to grow, teach, and be transformed, because in the end, the greatest reward is not the absence of struggles, it is the certainty of God's presence in every step. And so, walking with perseverance, John approached the end of his journey, where the greatest of all encounters awaited him, the reunion with the Father in eternity. The years passed, and John's life was marked by spiritual depth, sincere service, and a faith that withstood the seasons of the soul. He was no longer the same man who had once felt lost and empty. That wounded and confused John had been transformed day after day by the grace and love of the Father. Now, in the last years of his life, John carried in his eyes a gentle light and in his heart an unshakable certainty. He knew that his journey on this earth was coming to an end, but there was no fear, only expectation. John longed for the reunion with the Father, the one he had learned to love with all his being. He often meditated on Paul's words, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. From now on there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness." 2 Timothy 4:7-8. His body was already tired, but his soul was as alive as ever. John spent much time in prayer, not asking but giving thanks. His conversations with God were deep and full of reverence. He prayed for his grandchildren, for his church members, for the young people he had once discipled. His spirituality was now silent but powerful. John understood that true worship does not require a crowd, only a surrendered heart. And while many saw aging as a decline, John saw it as preparation for the great encounter. "I am going home," he would say serenely. He had already understood that death is not the end of the road for the Christian. It is the bridge to the fullness of salvation, the portal to eternity with divinity. In his final days, John had one desire: to gather his children and grandchildren for a final conversation. He did not want to leave behind possessions, but blessings. He shared testimonies, recalled biblical passages that had marked his life, and exhorted each one to remain firm in the faith. He asked that they never to abandon prayer, to love the church, to live with purpose. It was a moment of profound worship, even without music, even without formal worship. The presence of God there was palpable, and John, with shining eyes, said, "Everything I have experienced was worth it for this moment, because now I know I am going to meet the Father, to the throne room, to the holy place where there is no more pain, no more tears, no more separation." And everyone understood this was more than a farewell. It was a revelation. That early morning, while the sky was still dark, John departed in peace. There was no tumult, no commotion, only a silence full of glory. Like Stephen, he saw the heavens opened, Acts 7:55-56. And in the invisible, the greatest of all encounters took place, the eternal embrace with the Father. The faith that sustained him was transformed into vision, hope into reality, worship into fullness. John entered eternity as someone returning home after a long journey. And there, before the glory, he heard the words that every faithful servant longs to hear: "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord." Matthew 25:21. The salvation he had sought so much was now lived to the full. And so John's life became an eternal testimony. He was not remembered for his riches, but for his faith. Not for his titles, but for his spirituality. Not for his human greatness, but for his love for the doctrine and his total dedication to his mission. Religion, which was once just a family tradition, became for him a path of transformation and revelation. And what began with doubts and stumbles ended in glory and eternity. John's journey of faith reminds us that every step, every prayer, every tribulation faced with perseverance, everything has a purpose. And that, for those who love God, nothing is in vain. Because at the end of the road, there is no darkness, there is light, there is no end, there is reunion, and eternity is just the beginning. And now tell me, where are you on this journey? Are you lost in the sand, or can you already glimpse the sky? Share with me here in the comments. Your experience may touch other lives. If this video spoke to you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel and activating the bell. This is essential so that you don't miss the upcoming content that will continue to strengthen your faith and guide you towards salvation. See you in the next video, and may God bless you powerfully.